What's up, everyone? This is Joseph with the Cardinal Rule, and I'm going to do a live 7-round mock draft using PFF's mock draft simulator and use it as an opportunity to talk about some of the Cardinals' positions of need, certain players I like for the Cardinals, and just a few other things about draft strategy in terms of what I think the Cardinals might be looking at. Now, this isn't necessarily what I think the Cardinals will do in every single pick, but I am going to try to keep in mind some of the players that they have met with, some of the players I've heard they like, and in general, players that I think would be a good fit in terms of what they look for at different positions. So without further ado, let's get into the mock draft. So we're going to adjust the settings just a little bit here. We're going to slant it a little bit more towards PFF's board, maybe a little more care for positional value, and bring the randomness down. All right, so let's go and get it started. Now, I'm not going to trade up in the first round. I'm going to let it go all the way to 23, see who's on the board, and then go from there. Now, there's a couple really intriguing players here. Zion Johnson, Sky Moore, Travis Jones, who would be a really great fit in terms of that interior defensive line. George Pickens, who I think would be a good fit in terms of what they like on the outside at receiver. Jermaine Johnson, a really good edge rusher. Arnold Ebiketie, Kenyon Green, Nick Benito. Treylon Burks, a receiver that a lot of people really like and hope the Cardinals take. A guy they've met with a couple of times, so he could be an interesting fit. Boye Mafia, a really nice edge rusher here. And Jahan Dotson, a receiver that's been linked to the Cardinals in a number of mock drafts. Now, when I look at the first round, I think some of the biggest needs for the Cardinals are receiver. Edge rusher is probably the biggest need. I think they have a needed offensive line, especially when you consider that only 2 of their offensive linemen on the roster right now are signed through 2023. Everyone except for Josh Jones and Rodney Hudson is going to be a free agent after this season. I think they'll extend some of those guys, re-sign some of them, but they do need to look towards the future at offensive line. Run defense was one of their biggest weaknesses last year, so Travis Jones certainly would be nice. They have some need for cornerback in terms of looking for someone who could become a true number 1 outside cornerback. Now, my thinking here, though, is I'm not going to go edge rusher, even though there's a couple nice players here. I think there's a couple guys that I like that might be available in round 2. Receiver is definitely a consideration, and Zion Johnson is the guy that I look at here, would say if I'm picking at 23, that's probably the guy I really want to take there. But what I also am concerned with the Cardinals is that they don't have any picks in rounds 4 or 5. So it would be nice to move back a few spots and see if I can get some draft capital a little bit later. So there are a number of trade offers here on the board, going from really 25 on up to, into the second round. So what I'm going to look at here is I'm going to see what I can get if maybe I trade back a couple spots with Buffalo, 25 for 23. I don't think they're going to offer a second round pick. That would be not accepted. Could I get a third round pick? 54% chance. Okay. So I could move back a couple spots, get a third round pick. I'm going to see if they accept that offer. They do. So we're going to move back a couple spots and see who's still on the board. And look at that. We moved back a couple spots. Zion Johnson's still there. Andrew Booth, and then Jermaine Johnson are the players that went. I'm going to go ahead and take Zion Johnson. I like this. I moved back a couple spots, got another pick on day 2, but still get the guy I probably would have taken there. And I think Zion Johnson, he'll compete for a starting job this year. And if he doesn't win this year, he's likely to be the starter next year and moving forward. So let's go with Zion Johnson here at pick 25. Now we go all the way down to pick 55, and let's see who's still on the board here. So when I get to the second round, what I'm usually looking at is edge rusher. If I haven't gone edge rusher in the first round, I pretty consistently go edge rusher here. This is a really deep class for edge rusher, so I think there's a lot of value here in the second round, and that's probably the biggest area of need for the Cardinals right now. Chandler Jones left in free agency, so currently they have Marcus Golden on one side, who I really love as a player. I think he's really a good edge rusher and kind of underrated. But across from him, they've got Devin Kennard, Dennis Gardeck, Victor Dimukeje, and that's kind of a platoon that has some potential, but there's not a guy who's a bona fide starter that I feel really solid about right now. So I'd like to see them get someone who could compete for that other starting job. Now, Josh Pascal is a guy I really like. He's a really good run stopper, but he's also good as a pass rusher. He's got an interesting build. He's 6'4", 268. So I think he's stout enough that he would really be a good versatile player on the defensive line and edge rusher. So that's an interesting name. Let's see what other edge rushers are still here. We have to go a ways down, and I think I think that there's, Cameron Thomas, who's a little bit bigger, 6'4", 267. He's also another guy that's interesting. Now there's a name here that's hard to pass up, Christian Watson at number 75, who is a really good receiver. I don't think he's actually still going to be on the board at this point when the draft comes around. Some people see him as a first round pick or someone who might, sneak into the first round, but that's a tough guy to pass up on. But edge rusher is a big area of need here as well. So I could go ahead and go edge rusher. I don't think Christian Watson will still be there, but if I go Christian Watson, I don't think I'm getting Cameron Thomas. I'm really going a little bit further down on the developmental edge rusher, but there's a guy like Sam Williams here who's kind of interesting, who might still be there. 13 sacks, pass rush grade's pretty good. I'll tell you what, as much as I would love to take Josh Pascal here, and I really like him as a player, I think it's hard to pass up if Christian Watson is here still. This guy has some amazing traits. I think he's not going to be there at 55, but if he did end up sliding to 55, I have a hard time passing on him. So I'm going to go ahead and take Christian Watson here. And then we're going to go down to 87 and, see who's there in terms of edge rushers, see if there's someone that we can work with. Dominique Robinson out of Miami, Ohio, had 4 sacks. So he's more of, I think probably a traits projection, wasn't real productive. Another, out of University of Alabama, Birmingham, Alex Wright, big physical edge. He graded well. This is an interesting developmental guy. D'Angelo Malone is, I know, a guy who a lot of people really like him as a potential edge rusher. He's been getting a little bit of hype lately. Sam Williams from Ole Miss, we looked at before, 13 sacks. He's a solid edge rusher. So there's a number of different players you can go with here in terms of edge rusher. I know there's a couple other interesting positions like cornerback and Fedaria Mathis is defensive interior, but we have another pick at 89. So I'm going to go with a guy that I think might be the best edge rusher on the board still. Maybe I'm wrong here, but I'm going to go with Sam Williams out of Ole Miss. Had 13 sacks, graded reasonably well. We're going to go with him, get an edge rusher. I would have liked to get one of the edge rushers that was a little bit further up on the list, but, when Christian Watson was there still at pick 55, I just couldn't pass on that. Now, we have some interesting, players here. Tariq Woolen's a quarterback with some really outstanding traits. Got some interesting offensive linemen here. Sean Ryan, Max Mitchell, a cornerback here. Cam Jurgens might be the best center in this draft, or the second best center in this draft, arguably. But I'm going to go with Fedaria Mathis here, defensive interior out of Alabama. Like I mentioned earlier, run defense was the biggest weakness in the Cardinals defense. He's decent against the run, gives you a little bit of, a power rush on the inside. Alabama has a lot of great athletes that come in, versatile two-gap run defender. I think that's a really good fit for what the Cardinals need with their defense. So I'm going to go with Fedaria Mathis here at pick 89. And then that's going to take us, though, to that long stretch where we have to wait for pick 201. So now the Cardinals have 5 picks in the last 2 rounds. You're going to be looking for value players that slid here, players who have developmental traits. So let's take a look at who's here. I can tell you, though, with the very first pick we're going to get here at 201, I'm going to be seeing what running backs are still on the board. Cardinals could use some players, use someone in that running back room to go along with Benjamin, James Conner, Jonathan Ward. And a lot of the running backs I like are gone, not surprisingly. Let's see. A guy that's still here that I like is Darien Ely, a good receiving back. Abram Smith's a little bit of an interesting back. He graded well. CJ Verdell. There's Kennedy Brooks is interesting. Isaiah Pacheco, I think that's a guy that Brett Coleman talked about a little bit on one of his videos. But I'm going to go with Darien Ely. I think he might be the best receiving running back left on the board. And with Chase Edmonds having left in free agency, Ely's a little smaller than Edmonds was, or a little bit lighter. But he's a good receiving running back, and that's kind of, I think, what they need is a change of pace back, someone who can catch the ball, maybe even line up as slot receiver sometimes in some of their sets like they did with Edmonds. So I'm going to go with Ely here, who I think might be the best option left in terms of the running backs. All right, now we get to pick 215. And here what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look and see what value is still here. Players that I like that slid this far that I may be surprised that are still there. If you have been part of my Mock Draft Monday live stream, we all love Matt Ariza around these parts, but I'm actually not going to pick Ariza. I don't think they're going to be looking in that direction as much as I'd love them to do that. And I think what I'm going to do here is I see a player in Darien Kendrick here, a cornerback out of Georgia. Now, I know people have mixed opinions about him as a prospect. He's got good size. PFF says has great ball skills, but some people wonder, on that loaded Georgia defense, is he a product of that, or is he, really a guy who could make it in the NFL? Graded pretty well, had 4 interceptions, but again, he's on a great defense. But when you're looking at players in round 6 and 7, you're taking shots on guys, and a guy who had the talent to play at Georgia in the SEC. If you're looking at a guy in round 6 who you want to develop and see if he can become a player for you, that's a direction I wouldn't mind going in terms of a late round pick. So we're going to take Darien Kendrick, get a cornerback in round 6, someone they might look to develop some depth at that position. All right, so now we're going to see who else is here. Now, Mekhi Polk is an interesting receiver that, he's big, he ran fast, but there's someone I like a little bit better as a developmental receiver a little bit later. So I'm going to see who else is still on the board. Got some running backs, some offensive linemen, but I see a player here that I really like that I think would be an interesting fit for the Cardinals, and that's tight end Cole Turner. Now, he's not going to do much in terms of blocking. He's just not built for that. Really, when you look at him on tape, he's actually built a lot like a guy who was on the Cardinals a few years ago, Dan Arnold. In fact, I've often compared Cole Turner to him. If you watch his highlights, he looks like Dan Arnold with a bigger catch radius, in my opinion, built very much like him. Now, the Cardinals don't have an immediate need at tight end. They re-signed Zach Ertz and Max Williams and brought in a free agent, Steven Anderson, who's a depth tight end and a special teams contributor. But I like the idea of bringing in Cole Turner and, having him as a, 7th round pick who might develop into a nice little receiving depth tight end for you, very similar to what they had in Dan Arnold. So I'm going to take him at pick 244. And, the Cardinals, despite having re-signed all those tight ends that I mentioned earlier, have met with tight ends during this offseason, and they've gone to some of their pro days. So they may have an interest in tight end despite the fact that they brought back Ertz and Max Williams. So we're going to go with Cole Turner. All right, now we've got back-to-back picks for the Cardinals here, 256, 257. So I'm going to start by seeing who's on the board that I like, someone maybe who kind of slid. Let's see. Isaac Taylor Stewart, interesting cornerback, but we did do a cornerback earlier. But I'll tell you what, I see a player here that I think is an interesting developmental player at tackle, Jatir Carter. Now, he's out of Southern University, which is a small university. It's not a major program, obviously, but when you're going in the 6th and 7th round, one of the things you're looking for are players that have traits that translate to the NFL. And you're going to find a lot of players like Carter who maybe were at smaller universities, or maybe they didn't produce much, but they've got those physical traits, and teams look for those guys because they think they can coach them up at the next level. And if they've got the physical traits, they have a chance. Now, unfortunately, what you also find sometimes in round 6 and 7 are players who were productive in college but don't have those physical traits. And the Cardinals drafted a couple of those guys over the last couple of years. They drafted a couple of years ago linebacker Evan Weaver, who was really productive, got a ton of tackles in college, but just didn't have the physical traits to stick at the NFL level. And then last year, they drafted a center in Michael Manet, who was kind of a similar story. He was a starter, for I think his full college career, a solid college player, but just didn't have the physical traits to develop into a player that could stick in the NFL. And I think Jatir Carter is one of those developmental players that, he might be on the practice squad, this year. Maybe he is on the back end of the roster. But, when you're looking for a guy in the 7th round, you're looking for a guy that you might be able to develop, he fits that bill. So I'm going to take him here, get us a developmental tackle, and then I'm going to go for a receiver who I really like as a developmental receiver because I think he fits what the Cardinals look for, and that's Isaiah Weston. Isaiah Weston is 6'4", 214. He played at Northern Iowa, so it's a little bit smaller, program. So, the competition level is a concern, but also, he didn't have necessarily the same kind of quarterback throwing to him you might find at a bigger program. But he is a guy who has those traits you look for, and the Cardinals like those big receivers on the outside, like, AJ Green, guys who can go up for 50-50 balls like DeAndre Hopkins, Antoine Wesley. So I think Isaiah Weston is a guy who fits that bill that, in the 7th round, if you're looking for a guy who you can develop, maybe he's on the practice squad, maybe he does make the roster, but he has those traits they're looking for and they could develop. I think that's an interesting pick for a flyer here in round 7. So we're going to go with Isaiah Weston. All right, they are grading the draft, and now let's take a look at the overall draft. So we traded back, like I mentioned, picked up some draft capital, got Zion Johnson. I really like that pick. Didn't expect Watson to be there, but he was there, so we took him. Got some edge help. Would have liked to gone edge earlier, but it was too tempting to take Watson and Johnson. I just couldn't pass on those guys. Got some nice interior defensive line help in Fedarian Mathis. I think that might be one of my favorite picks in this draft to get him in round 3. Got a running back for the running back room, Jaron Ely, developmental cornerback, tight end, another developmental offensive lineman, and a receiver to develop. I think overall we hit a lot of the areas of need for the Cardinals. There's only so many picks, so you can't necessarily get all the depth you'd like at all those positions. So overall, I feel pretty good about this draft. PFF didn't grade it as well as I think they should have, but that's okay. Who are some of the players you'd like to see the Cardinals draft this year? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on The Cardinal Rule.